From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs, and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
And hello again. Welcome to yet another edition of Chicago Newsroom. Sad to say, our first September show. I'm kind of sorry to see the summer disappearing as fast as it has. Haven't even had a chance to get myself, fitted for my pink cap for next year when I'm going to do the triathlon. Oh, that'll happen because I may not be fit to be a talk show host, but I'm also not a fit talk show host. But that's the way it is here in Chicago. Our mayor continues to make the news He creates the news everywhere he goes. And last night we saw a raucous thing out at Malcolm X College. We'll be talking about that today with George Schmidt, who's joining us today. George is with Substance Newspaper and substancenews.net. Right? .net. Always get that one confused. And George, it's not really, it's kind of disingenuous to say you're a reporter for Substance. I think you created it, didn't you, many years ago?
Right now I'm a reporter.
You're a reporter, yeah.
The editor still.
A humble reporter at Substance, and you'll see how humble George is as we get into the conversation, I'm sure. Elias Cepeda is joining us today from Extra Newspaper, managing editor, Extra bilingual newspaper in Chicago. So we're going to try to figure out today where we can begin to put some perspective on all of this. We're seeing, even last week, of course, we were talking a lot about the longer school day, the 2% offer, the turning down of the 2% offer, the rescission of the 4%. We're going to throw a lot of numbers at you today, but I hope we'll do it in a way that makes it interesting and kind of informative. And, of course, we want to talk about the schools, but maybe we ought to begin with the police, because this is amazing. You have the superintendent of police on one day admitting that they don't have enough cops to answer all the 911 calls. I mean, I've never heard of anything like that. That's amazing. It's an incredible admission. And then the next day coming out and saying, oh, but we can easily, well, not easy, he didn't say easily, but we can find $190 million in the budget to do what the mayor says and cut the budget by $190 million in the police department. What's going on?
I don't know if he was trying to create an ethos of credibility by the admission and everything else can be believed. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the administration, the mayor's office is not specifically copping to any number. But yeah, the numbers we're hearing are about what you're saying. And I don't know where that money would come from. And we've already had basically a personnel deficit in the police department for years and years. What do we have, like 2,000 below what?
It's always somewhere.
It's always somewhere around that level. So an additional 190 million. I mean, I know we have officers on the books that aren't really active. Maybe some of it will come from there, but the specifics are not there right now. It's all really vague and frankly kind of scary if you look at what we are dealing with.
What's interesting about this, George, I know you cover schools, but you've got to be an observer of all of this too. What's interesting about this to me is that by McCarthy's own admission, if they just didn't hire any more cops, that would be somewhere in the $90 million range maybe. We never know what any of these numbers really mean. But there's another 100 million somewhere. Now, one thing that is different is that we have not ever before seen the budget cutters going after the police department the way they always go after CPS and other, favorite groups to kick around. What do you think? Do you think there's $100 million in bureaucracy and waste and fraud in the police department?
No, that's ridiculous, but it's consistent with this administration's narrative or the reality. I mean, they were saying as late as the second hearing on the city budget that they cut $400 million from administrative bureaucracy at CPS.
Yeah,
that was never a real number. They included janitors and people, lunchroom workers in that, and then they just kept repeating it.
But you don't get to $400 million. You'd have to fire a lot of janitors to get to $400 million.
It's impossible. That number is not true. And I've been in an exchange with their chief communications officer, who, by the way, is in a new position at $160,000 a year salary that was just created since the mayor appointed his new school team, so-called. On the police end, they do a similar thing. They create an artificial deficit. They pad it with unfilled positions. They estimate the costs next year out of the unfilled positions. Then they don't fill them, but they should have, especially given some parts of the city. Another irony, because I was talking to some police officers last week about it, was when the mayor rode with the police unescorted and not as a media event about a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And he only spent a couple hours there because things lit up in Englewood where he was on the patrol. First there was a shooting, he got to the scene, and then somebody told me that somebody blew up a building and a drug thing a block away. And according to what I was told, the mayor just said, I've seen enough. So at least he knows what it's like for police officers on the street, sort of.
I had not heard that story.
Yeah, well, I heard it from somebody who I would trust this person as a source. So it's going into the school year. It's going to be very strange how they're going to do this, because the schools then are where the gang problem of the city impacts most directly, and unless the police are equipped to act with the schools to sort of nullify this stuff, by October and November, when everybody arrives at school, these things will light up in the schools and around the schools.
And there's also, I mean, we're kind of already way off the topic here, but there was also that little boomlet of a story a few months ago about the police officers that are assigned to schools, right? There were, I think is the right word, 2 police officers in every high school, every Chicago public high school.
Yeah.
And then, I don't remember exactly what happened, but wasn't there some kind of weird thing where they suddenly decided that that was going to have to get billed out of the school's budget to go to the police department, and that then as a result they might not have as many officers in the schools?
That's a great budget story if you want to spend 60 seconds on it.
Sure, we've got it.
Back when Mayor Daley took over, he ordered the schools to take police officers into the schools. There was a good reason for it and a bad reason. The good reason was that it put officers in the schools that needed it, but not all the high schools needed it. So there were 2 officers assigned out of the district to each school, and they actually had an office in the school of some kind. The problem was that was taking money out of the school budget and paying it directly to the police department, and that went on for years. In February 2010, the last time the board voted to pay for this, and was supposed to pay $8 million in the coming year, fiscal 2012, July 1st to June 30th, 2011 to 2012. When Jean-Claude Brizard came in, his team announced that they were going to pay $70 million. That was part of the deficit they laid out in June when they claimed they couldn't pay the teachers' raise. And we investigated. We said, what are you doing? You know, the agreement was for $8 million. Suddenly you say you're going to pay $70 million. And they said, well, we hadn't been paying enough.
Over the past
several years. Well, everybody knew. You know, the police service is supposed to be in the community anyway. So if the school's a focal point, then why isn't it being paid out of the city budget?
Well, were you able to, in this whole train of events, were you able to ascertain that the police department actually requested that money, or did the schools just volunteer it?
No. When this started in the 90s, it started in the mid 90s when Paul Vallis was head. It just began one year. It popped into the budget as an expense, and the money went under an intergovernmental agreement to the city of Chicago. And then they renewed that every couple of years like they did in 2010. This year, after cutting the teacher's salary, they agreed on raise, they on July 27th at the board meeting, they approved a new intergovernmental agreement that agreed to pay the city $62 million more than they had been required to pay. So we looked at that and we said, you know, that's like waking up one morning and saying, my mortgage is too low, I'm going to call the bank and tell them I'm going to pay 3 times as much. That's literally what this new Board of Education did on July 27th. Nobody reported it except us. Nobody discussed it except the teachers union and Substance. And it was just breathtaking when you think of the number of dollars. Especially in light of everything else that's going on with, this is happening at the same time that they're performing the rescission of the 4% raise for teachers because they don't have any money, and so on and so forth. But I still want to try to keep this focus a little bit on the police department, because Elias, the situation that we have right now is that
the mayor is claiming he's put 700 new police officers on the street, but of course I think we all know that they're not new police officers, and most of them were already on the street.
Yeah, that's that's true. It's not.
I
yeah,
mean, I don't want to be too cynical about
yeah,
this.
no, I mean it really does seem to be the case, and I mean you had the story about Englewood. It's not the only neighborhood that is really blowing up, and you had you have kind of strange things going on with the numbers, which I'm sure George can talk about as well, with crime rates, and where for the last number of years, the mayor's office, before it was this mayor, and past superintendent, were claiming decreases. It's just it's one of those things where even if the numbers are there, decreases in certain crime categories, it's the types of numbers that aren't really satisfying to people in the neighborhoods, because they feel how things are. And short of neighborhoods that are being gentrified at accelerated paces, and so the kind of the makeup is changing such that a lot of families that may be gang affiliated are moving out. There's really not a whole lot of improvement on the street, and there's not a whole lot more really attention, I think, in terms of an amount of personnel for police department, and in terms of strategy, because I think that needs to be discussed a lot too, is strategy and philosophy. I mean, there's a lot of good criminologists, including here in down the street at UIC, that have really looked at the types of training that different police officers in different neighborhoods get. And you've got, and I'll be colloquial here, but you've got kind of the officer-friendly approach for officers in districts that are maybe more affluent, generally more white, where they're to be seen as a part of the community, to help, to support, to problem solve, a little bit of prevention here and there in ways that are doable. Then you've got in a lot of minority areas, lower socioeconomic classes, and they've just got a whole different mindset, a whole different training that is a lot more cynical, that is a lot more aggressive. And policing is a hard job. I just think philosophy needs to be looked at as well. And I think I kind of feel the same way. It's analogous. It's not a perfect analogy, but with the school system, we talk a lot about numbers, and that's important. Resources are important. But we don't talk a whole lot about philosophy there either. We don't have oftentimes educators in key, kind of positions that have experience that can kind of talk about pedagogy or talk, I mean, there really needs to be talked about, I think, in schools and in policing, especially when we're dealing with huge budget shortfalls. It seems to be the best time to talk about what else we can do.
What can we do with what we've got?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. George, one of the reasons that I really wanted to get you on the show is because there's been a kind of a recurring theme here in the last couple of weeks around this table. I got into a little bit of a dialogue with Fred Klonsky on his blog over the last week, as he was on the show, and he took us to task last week. We had Rod Sierra on the program and a couple of other people last week, and we used the term brilliant to describe the mayor's issues management style in the way that he's been handling some of the stuff with the schools, in sort of putting something out there independent of the news cycle to let it get munched around for a few days before the union can get involved in it, and then the union is put into a kind of a reactive position. And I saw a very similar thing happening here. I'm sorry to keep bringing this up, but I'm seeing it again, where you have the mayor doesn't say it. The chief of police says, yeah, we're going to have to cut the budget really severely. And this is not done in conjunction or collaboration with the police union in any way. And then suddenly the police union is in this bizarre position of throwing stuff out there and saying, we're not going to give up our uniform allowances. We're not going to give up this and this and this. So negotiations have started in public, right where the mayor wants them, because he doesn't have to do it in private. He gets to do it in the news media without even having said a word. So I don't want to use the term brilliant again, because I did that last week and got in trouble. I didn't mean to say that it was brilliant to try to cut school teachers' pay. I just meant that the way they're doing it is pretty clever. And I think we're seeing it again. This is a guy who's spent a lot of time in Washington. He's very well versed in how to handle adversaries.
Short-term.
Your reaction.
Short-term and with an unbelievable degree of shallowness. I mean, I've been covering the mayor's media events this summer, not just the school
I know you
ones.
have, and you've been blogging.
And it's been sort of fun to watch how controlled they are and to watch a real pro in action. That's number one. You got to give it to him. He's setting an agenda, though, in a way that's going to be long-term destructive, is already short-term destructive, undermines his own credibility. And yet, because I think he got in the habit of trying to manage that crazy Washington, D.C. 24-hour news cycle, he's trying to do it here. And when you take either police or schools, you can't do it. These are long-term places in society that you need long-term, thoughtful solutions.
Excellent point.
You can't have government by publicity stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what we've had. And there's a second point for teachers. You know, I've been a member of the teachers union since 1969. And for teachers, and I'm sure it's for rank and file police, but I know them less, the idea that the best person to run the system comes from outside the city of Chicago and outside the system is an insult to everybody who's worked inside the system. And we have that now in both at CPS with Jean-Claude Brizard and at the police department with Gary McCarthy. And that's not going to change no matter how much these people try to get down with the rank and file. They're aliens to the system. The joke around the city now is that Brizard and his people need a GPS to find their way from Bowen to Bogan High School. And that shouldn't be. But Emanuel is still getting away with it because he's inundating what's left of the reporter crews in Chicago with daily media events and publicity stunts. And people are being ordered to charge out to every one of them. And just the last thing, because it's cute, and I'm going to be reporting this more, when you get to these events, there's a row of chairs behind which the TV cameras are set up, and then the mayor's podium is here. You know, and the background is whatever building or whatever place they're in. And it's always the same thing. It's a little bit sad to think of the history of Chicago journalism and to see all these people sitting there with their legs crossed taking notes like stenographers or you know, honors students in a lecture class at the university. I mean, that's not journalism. But I get a hunch that the media overlords in this town are saying, why aren't you covering this story? Because City Hall probably has 4 press flacks calling them up as soon as they put out the press release saying, here's the story of the day.
You may not know this, and I have to disclaim this every week on the show. I once was one of those stenographers who sat reporter when I worked for public radio, and then later on I went to work for the city and ended up in the mayor's press office. So I've seen this thing. I've seen this thing for 30 years on both sides. And it's not just Chicago. I mean, it's happening everywhere. But what you have now, as I think you've pointed out, is somebody who is just absolutely at the top of his game at being able to do this. And it's very interesting to see the whole sort of media government combine and where it's come here and what we're at today. It's sort of like I find myself at the point in this conversation where I want to get us into the bigger picture conversations, but I'm not exactly sure how to do it. And it's part of this whole thing. It's like, but we have this, the agenda has been set for us. We have $600 million we have to find. Next year we've got over $1 billion we've got to find. And so everything is in that context. It's kind of what you were saying. It's like we don't find the time to talk about the fact that the police department has huge issues that are not the same as, but are parallel to the issues that the schools are facing. And we haven't even touched on something like the fire department, which in itself is going through radical kinds of changes. I mean, it's not a fire department anymore. It's a medical service. Most of its calls, most of its runs are for ambulances, right?
Last night at Malcolm X College, the medical team from the fire department had to take away a person who fell down, just went down, an older person. And I got one shot of this. I'm just thinking, that's your point. And in the background of the shot is Ram's son, who was there. I mean, it was kind of an interesting just moment of the fire department doing its work, which it does so well. And and it was a nice moment for the firefighters, but they shouldn't be beaten up because the budget isn't, ready to pay them.
So, let me ask you, as a as a longtime union guy and union observer, are you fearful at this point for the CTU, and where is the CTU outgunned and outmanned in this fight? Because I have to tell you, that's kind of the impression that I'm getting.
Well, you don't know Karen Lewis yet.
Oh, she was on our very first show.
Okay,
so,
well, just to
yeah.
take it into context, because the CTU grew in strength after the 1960s. For the 50 years before the 1960s, there were teacher organizations that asked for things and begged, but the phrase used to be collective bargaining rather than collective begging. Mm-hmm. And then slowly the union grew in strength through the 70s and 80s, and then some of the leadership decided to try to cut a deal, be diplomatic instead of confrontational, and that was the agenda set under Mayor Daley in the 90s, and it undermined and weakened the union. But for the second time in the 21st century, in June 2010, the union membership elected a new leadership throughout, the former leadership, the ones that wouldn't study the budget and weren't interested in getting down to the nitty-gritty. And so Karen and a team, when I do some consulting for them, I got to tell you, so that
we all have to disclaim.
Disclaiming is okay. Full disclosure is fine. I'm also the parent of 2 children in the Chicago Public Schools. Whatever hat you want to wear in this town, it's available. That team is serious. I don't think the union's going to be weakened. The goal of the ruling class in this city, corporate elite or whatever we want to call it, and personified by the Civic Committee, the Commercial Club, the editorial board of the Tribune, and these people, seems to want a company union, a lapdog. They're furious that that's not happening now, and every news story in the Chicago Tribune reflects that fury, in my opinion. And that's a good place to go. The union, meantime, is organizing for a fight, and I don't think anybody wants it, but it's like soldiers who know how to go to war. People are saying now that entire schools are signing petitions saying, well, we're going to have to strike, let's get ready. My wife teaches at high school on the Northwest Side, and the vast majority, over 90% of the teachers up there are so angry at the way they've been treated, the way we've been slandered, et cetera, by the mayor, and what's coming, that the people who are playing this game are playing with fire. And it's like the children who don't know you're not supposed to light a firecracker while leaning down in front of it. That's the way I feel when I listen to these people talk.
I don't want to cut you off. I'm just a little jealous of our time. We have only a few minutes left, and you've been the guy that I've wanted to talk to about this stuff for so long, George, because I think we're seeing a general public that is beginning to turn against all manner of civic workers, whether it's firefighters or police or teachers or whatever it is. They're seeing years and years of concessions and benefits that they are not getting themselves, and they're saying these people need to feel some pain like I'm feeling.
Well, welcome to 1933 or 1923 or 1895. And unions have got to organize people and stand up for working people, or people get rolled over like has happened. And the fact that some of the union leaderships have allowed that to happen in this town, not only in the public sector, but most dramatically in the private sector, is an example of the work that has to be done. I think what happened by the 80s was people thought, wow, we won all this stuff. We had the United Auto Workers had serious contracts with provisions for retirees forever. Suddenly the narrative shifts. They leave out the fact that this was an agreement when a man or woman could hang 60 doors an hour on an assembly line, at age 30. Well, when you're 70, that's not going to happen. That's why the union would spread out this thing in the private sector. Suddenly you're reading in the New Yorker about how this cost-effectiveness model is the only model for society. It's ridiculous. Destruction isn't only of the unions, but it's of the rights of working people to even speak out. One of the reasons why the reporters in this town are so subservient, almost craven, is that they don't have an organization except for the headline club that can stand up to the boss and say, we're going to tell the truth no matter what you think the headline should be. And that's a problem we're not going to solve except by the organization of the people there, whether it's police officers, we're already organized there. Teachers, we're already organized for the most part, except for the charter schools, and we're getting to that. So the ability of that to happen is we're just in a new era. But I think we're heading towards, just like with this crazy economic policy, we're in 1937. Well, from 1937 to 1947, that was the greatest outburst of union organizing in the history of this country because of these attacks on people. So even though people are trying to say, well, you know, you should resent teachers for having a pension, majority of people aren't saying that. It's been, quote, the public supposedly, but the majority of people aren't saying that. If you poll people about the public schools, majority always say the public schools are good. And then you hear this whole elite saying, oh, waiting for Superman, got to replace him. Same nonsense is just being shoveled out. But, you know, if you read the Tribune from the 1930s, you got the same nonsense. If you read the Tribune from the 1960s, it was even more delightful. You know, they had the FBI was feeding stories for page 1 against Martin Luther King. So we're back in the same time. Let's have fun, enjoy it, get organized, and sing a lot of songs and stuff.
Sing a lot of songs.
We're seeing the aggressiveness in the CTU, but we're not really seeing kind of a lucid argument laid out like George just did for the value, let's say, of organizing for all working people. We're also not seeing them kind of look at things and present things to the public in a comprehensive way. So, for example, why aren't they talking about tax increment financing districts? We've got like a $500 million a year, I believe, slush fund, which basically takes money from schools. There's no oversight. The mayor's saying he's going to address that now, but we're not examining whether or not that needs to exist. I mean, it'd be, the aggressiveness is there, but you know, it would be interesting to see if they could start laying things out in the manner that you're laying them out now, because they seem to be really taking a drubbing.
Mr. Schmidt,
I mean,
you have 45 seconds.
Well,
to
in
respond
45
to
seconds, I say if you take the TIF issue, you know, I was at the police station when Jackson Potter, who's the chief staff organizer for the union, was being bailed out after a TIF protest at Grossinger Cadillac because they got a subsidy. I mean, the union has...
I didn't see anything about that in the paper.
Well,
all right, okay, all right.
It's a matter of coverage. The union has been literally the cutting edge. You know, Ben Joravsky and the old Neighborhood Capital Budget Group did the research on the TIF ripoff. The union, the Chicago Teachers Union, in alliance with a lot of parent community and other groups, has been the cutting edge for the past 2 years under the leadership of Karen Lewis and the group that's now running the union in raising the TIF issue. And last week, Rahm gets up with his TIF task force and says, well, we're not going to do anything different. The money's going to stay under my control, but it's going to be more transparent. And oh, by the way, delightfully, he has a 5-year plan. I wrote in my notebook, Stalin, question mark.
Well, we got to see what happens with that 2% and the longer day and all the rest of it. Yesterday, I called up Ben Joravsky and said we got to have you back on the show because we don't need you anymore. The mayor has said the TIF has been fixed, so we won't need your services anymore. So we'll have him on next week just to congratulate the mayor on all the good work he's done. Thanks very much for watching. It's been a delight having both of you here today. George Schmidt from Substance and Elias Cepeda from Extra Bilingual Newspapers. And we'll have you both back again if you'll come. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. Of course, you can find us here on cable, but you can see this and all the other programs online at cantv.blip.tv. You can check us out there. You can also subscribe to us, and I wish you would, on iTunes as an audio podcast or a video podcast. Great thing to, take a little walk and listen to the show. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ken Davis, and we'll see you next week on Chicago Newsroom.